Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you, sir?
I am doing well. I wish the country was doing as well as I feel.
Good.
But we want to talk about one of the defects in the policies of our administration, having to do with foreign policy. And the big news really over the weekend, or as the weekend was breaking, was what did Trump finally do about Iran? Would he decertify? Would he certify? Well, he figured it out. He would decide to do neither.
Yeah.
He sort of put it into limbo. Well, let Congress sort all this out. But he's pretty explicit on his position. And like we've said in the past, he flip-flops a lot. But he hasn't been really a flip-flopper on Iran. He's just really taken a position which fits into the position of the neocons and other special interest groups that Iran is they're bad actors and they have to deal with them. And he's sticking to that principle. But right now, even his own staff are getting concerned about the warmongering policies that he has. You know, this idea of not certifying is significant. It's challenged an agreement that was made a year or so ago that really we thought was moving in the right direction. Exactly how it came about, there might be some questions, but it at least moved an agreement to the point where we were going to talk to the Iranians, and everybody agrees, I think including the president, that they haven't broken their agreement. They still did not do anything that should justify decertification. And his generals have agreed with backing off a little bit, and they might have modified his position. Maybe he was ready to decertify, you know, that's his language, but his staff was scurrying around to say, is there something else that we can do that we can stall this for a while? And that's where we are. It's sort of going back to the Congress. Now, Congress, you'll see AIPAC and the neocons and all the warmongers. They're going to line up, and they were able to get almost anything they ever wanted in the Congress. So who knows? Even though there's people who are seriously challenging this, some who even were opposed to the treaty, they just would like to keep their hands off. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But one thing I want to talk a little bit about, and you've looked into this a bit, is the misinformation. You know, how many things are being said by the administration and Trump himself. It's just misleading. Sometimes if I accidentally pick up a news show on a rare television, I want to just say, that's not true. That's not true. You know, there's so much deceit. And he says it with such authority. Sometimes I think he may even believe that.
Well, you know, he was in a bind because he could not find Iran in non-compliance because of the simple fact that they are in compliance. The IAEA has agreed that they've been in compliance since the deal was concluded. All of our allies and partners internationally agree that they have been in complete compliance. You know, this is an objective thing. There's not wiggle room. They either did this or they didn't. And thus far, they're in compliance. So what he did is he found some wiggle room in the legislation that Congress passed to approve President Obama, then President Obama's accession to this agreement. And that wiggle room was a clause giving the president authority to determine whether the sanctions regime was appropriate and proportionate. And so he took that little bit out. And that's essentially what he did. He didn't abrogate it. As you said, he didn't do any of these things technically because he couldn't. He took a little wiggle room and says it's not in our interest and they're awfully bad people.
Right. And there's been pretty strong reports, things we've been very much aware of, that one of his closest advisors on this issue is Nikki Haley. And he loves her. He said, of course, she has a good podium at the United Nations, and you hear a lot about it. And the interesting conflict between Tillerson and Trump is that why does Tillerson put up with this? You know, all the insults that Trump throws out at him, and they have some disagreement. And Tillerson comes across as a more reasonable person. But we also know that Haley would like to have his job, and Trump would probably appoint her, but he's not going to fire Tillerson, but he's trying to, my guess is that he might be just trying to get him to resign. But if somebody wonders about Haley, because she hasn't been known, she's governor of South Carolina, she's not known in the circles, on international affairs, But she has a teacher, very important teacher, the person that she looks up to. His name happens to be John Bolton. So that should perk up everybody's ears if they want to think about how do you avoid war? Why should war be a first option? And think about the Iraq War, and all of a sudden you think, this is where he's getting his advice now, is how do you stir up another battle like Iraq and confront the Iranians because they're such bad people, according to Trump?
I'm convinced that if you got close enough to Nikki Haley and pulled off her mask, you'd see John Bolton, that it's him. And this is the same John Bolton who said the Iraqi people are much better off now than they were under Saddam Hussein. You know, with 1 million dead, the country in total turmoil, 13-year, 14-year war. This is what he believes. He was one of the prime suspects of lying us into the war. Everything he said was a lie about Iraq, promising how great it would be. And somehow he's not discredited. You know, I love this line in your column for today. I mean, essentially, don't these people have any shame? You know, when they do something so horrible. And so you're right, Nikki Haley has no experience. She's not a foreign policy person, but she has somebody whispering in her ear, and then she's whispering into Trump's ear, and this is what they're saying. It's the same warmed over neocon stuff that they've been saying about Iran for 10 or 15 years, all disproven in the 07 NIE, the intelligence community's assessment of Iran, all disproven, but they continue it.
You know, this principle of not having any shame is a characteristic of a sociopath.
Yeah.
And one time somebody suggested that so-and-so was, well, I think he was using the term against Hillary. She's a sociopath. She has no shame. Then I got to thinking about it, that anybody that's in a position of reasonable leadership in Washington, they all have this tendency to be sociopathic. They never, whether it's economic policy or foreign policy, if it does a lot of harm, it's rationalized away. Well, we had to mismanage and this happened, unintended consequences. It was his fault. It was a partisan thing. You know, the Congress wouldn't help us, but they have no shame, and that's why this doesn't bother them. They don't look and say, well, this might go in the opposite direction, and maybe it will backfire on us. They just bulldoze ahead, and unfortunately, Bolton is a very, very influential person right now. So I think this policy is not going to change. It'll be interesting to see how the House and the Senate handles this, because I think it looks like some votes would need 60% of the vote in the Senate, and others would be a majority vote. But I don't think it is going to be smooth sailing, because there are so many disagreements. But then I also look at who really has the influence in the Congress. Who are the lobbyists? And AIPAC is a powerful lobbyist, and they have something to say about it. And then you have people like Rubio. He's sort of in opposition to some of the hawkish congressmen like McCain and Graham, because they want to, you know, fix it to their agreement, move it in that direction. And Rubio says, absolutely not. We have to destroy this. He wants to get rid of it. And that's his goal. So he and Nikki Haley, they're probably the two closest, most radical neoconservatives there are.
And let's look at how the American people view the neocons, you know, because John Bolton was toying with the idea of running for president last time. He bought a lot of ads on Twitter, touting himself as a great expert, and he was literally laughed out of polite society. He's routinely despised. He's thought of as one of the worst. Same with, look what happened to Lindsey Graham when he actually ran for president. You know, maybe 3 people voted for him, and one of them was probably his own mother. I mean, these ideas are super unpopular. They can't be elected. But somehow when someone like Trump is elected, they just wean their way in, and they weasel their way in. Here they are again.
You know, another thing that they throw out there just to convince everybody that how bad the Iranian people are, and they do have their problems, and we don't defend them for that. We just try to talk about our policy. But, you know, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, it's big. It has influence. They have 125,000, but they paint them as if they run the Middle East, you know, and that they are the monster. But just for instance, how would you compare the ability of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to influence world politics compared to our CIA and our special forces.
Yeah, it's not even essentially, you know, in the same ballpark. And essentially, you know, the Revolutionary Guards, it sounds scary, and they like to say that word, but essentially what the Revolutionary Guard is the special forces of the Iranian army. You know, it's their special forces. And yes, they're active in Syria, they're fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and they were invited by the legitimate Syrian government, unlike the U.S.
And I think it was started, if I'm correct, it was after the Iranian Revolution, and they threw out the Shah, and they had to have somebody protecting their religious leaders, because they thought, well, what did the CIA do in 1953? Is it possible that the CIA is still around, or have they been extinguished in the United States? Oh, no, they're still around. So, in a way, it was a defensive mechanism, because it started, you know, just as a religious protection of their leaders, but obviously they are involved in their geographic closeness to these other countries, where, you know, it involves them, and it also involves legitimate invitation by governments in control in there. That is a little bit different than we decide to build bases in different places of the world, or we decide, well, Assad has to go, and we would actually send over assistance to some of the radicals, the good radicals, not the bad radicals,
that's right.
You know, the moderates, and give them monies and weapons to do their bidding. So that is a little bit different. But and you mentioned it in the opening that there's been a lot of lies told, and empires do have to lie in order to justify, because quite frankly, as important as we think this is and how obvious we think the facts are, you know, we probably wouldn't win a popularity contest if you went out on the street. First thing is, somebody would say, where is this place you're talking about? They wouldn't know or care. But other ones would be pretty convinced that, you know, what they hear on television, that these people are monsters, and how about the money? Most people, most Americans would believe that we took money from American taxpayers and sent it over there, but that isn't exactly what happened.
And even Trump even mentioned this in his speech. You know that that crazy Obama, he sent, you know, carton loads, boatloads of money over. He flew over and dropped it over to them, as if we somehow paid them off for the deal. But the fact of the matter is, whatever you think about Iran, that money, all or at least part of it, was money that they put down to buy U.S. fighter jets before 1979. So they paid up front all these millions of dollars. The revolution happened, and the U.S. said, hey, we're not going to give you your deposit back. You know, and that money's been sitting there since '79. And so as part of this deal, as part of a negotiation of diplomacy, give and take, you know, part of it was giving their money back.
You know, I often wonder about how much they believe themselves. You know, like the president says it all the time, but I just wonder whether it ever crossed his mind that, you know, you're really not accurate in what you're saying. And we get no help from the media. The media, would they ever ask the question at a press conference and put person on the spot? But this is what always bothers me, is this march to war is bipartisan. You know, there's no philosophic differences. There'll be some bickering to try to get one up on the other party, but policies don't change very often. And let's just hope that this isn't a dramatic, you know, acceleration that it could be. And who knows what will happen in 60 days. That means by the end of the year, we may know something different, and we're going to hear a lot about it. But it could be a very dangerous move.
Yeah, and you know, we both read a piece by Paul Pillar, who had spoke at a couple of the lunches back on the Hill, a friend of ours. He was in the CIA under President Bush and before, and an expert in the Middle East. But he did a very good piece in the National Interest, where he just took apart some of what President Trump said in the speech that was just simply wrong. The heavy water issue, for example, the idea that they violated the treaty because they're heavy water. Well, when their stores of heavy water ran up to the limit, they did exactly what the agreement called for. They sold some, they got rid of it, and they brought it back down. The other issue, they intimidated international inspectors. They gave not a shred of evidence that they have ever done that. No one has ever said that. But remember when Scott Ritter spoke at our conference last month, he said this is exactly what they're going to do. They're going to make it harder and harder for the inspectors because they're going to push Iran, push Iran, push Iran, and then as soon as Iran lets out a pip, they're going to say, There you go, because that's exactly what they did in Iraq.
Well, Trump accused them of being allies with Al-Qaeda. And remember, that's similar to what they did in Iraq.
Yeah.
Remember?
They did 9/11.
After 9/11, they were responsible for 9/11, and the American people believed it, and that they had nuclear weapons. It's all over and over again. So it's not a happy situation, to say the least.
No, and it's rife with error. The fake assertion that Iran was ready to collapse when Obama rescued it by giving them all this aid. The whole speech was just peppered with lies. But I do like one thing that Paul Pillar said about this, because the rationale, one of the rationale that Trump uses and Trump's people use to pull out is that, oh, some of these provisions restricting Iran are going to sunset in 10 or 20 years. And so let's pull out so they sunset now. But Pillar made a good point, you know, that getting out of the agreement because of the restrictions on Iran will sunset is like committing suicide because you're afraid of death. You know, I mean,
well, it's not very logical, but they don't brag about their logic. They brag about how brilliant they are, and they're going to take care of us and keep peace in the world. But you know, it's also interesting about how some of these agreements come up, and what might have happened if the non-interventionists were in charge way back. I can't see non-interventionists getting so deeply involved. But then again, what do you do when it's all messy and you're trying to extricate ourselves? You know, one thing that they did on NAFTA, when they wanted NAFTA passed, they didn't do a treaty, and that was a treaty. It should have been, you know, supported by 2/3 of the Senate, but it never did that. Now they have this mess, and you do have to work within the international community in order to try to get out. And of course, the way the Constitution is written, that these agreements should be more bilateral, and the Congress should initiate trade agreements and all these other things. But right now it looks messy, but we have oftentimes complimented the previous administration for moving in the right direction, and this brings up the subject of those other countries who agreed with this, the P5 plus Germany, and you hear two stories right now. One is that they are really hacked off and they don't like it. They like the agreement and they don't like what Trump is doing, and others would say, yeah, but you know, when push comes to shove, the Europeans are just going to do what we tell them to do. We are the economic and the military power of the world. And I think that is yet to be settled because, you know, in the midst of a severe downturn and a challenge to the dollar, maybe the Europeans wouldn't give us an inch. But even under these circumstances, it might be up for discussion. Maybe the Europeans aren't going to roll over and they're going to say, all right, you go your way, do what you want, but we're trading. And evidently Germany is the country that has most at stake in trade with Iran.
And the Europeans immediately released a statement after President Trump's speech condemning what he's saying. So I think they're trying to play tough, but I think it is a good question. Will they roll over? As we've mentioned on this show several times, trade between Iran and the EU has been up 79% since the agreement, so they're making money. My last, I guess, statement would be that what Trump is doing is he's also hurting the United States. Iran is desperate to buy a bunch of planes from us. That's a lot of good-paying jobs, all gone if he continues this way. So I do want to remind everyone again about Dr. Paul's new book and how you can get your personalized copy of Dr. Paul's new book. And I'm doing this every day or every other day at least because we only have through October to get your copy. And a matter of fact, we got to get some more copies ordered because people are responding in a big time. So get your copy quick.
Sounds good. Looks like there are a few people out there that still believe in non-intervention. And Daniel, you're right about this being detrimental, what Trump is doing to the United States. But the bigger picture is what is happening right now. And the way we get involved in war is a detriment to peace. And that, of course, is one of the major goals of this program, is to try to explain to people why non-interventionism is the best way to work toward peace and prosperity. And as long as we are able to do this, and as long as nobody closes down our website, we're going to keep talking about the best way to achieve peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.